when you create your content, for example, you have this beautiful video background, and how intentionally do you tell your story as a part of yourself? So is it something that you always tell and then in a shorter version, and when it comes to a keynote it is the long version? So how do you choose this for yourself?
Yeah, I think it's all about context and like what's the audience and what's the purpose,
Okay.
right? So I think there will be times that I'll embed my story as like literally almost a sentence where it's like I was run over by a truck, my arm was ripped off, right? There's a slightly more robust version than that. There's a version that I just told, which is often a similar platform that I tell on these types of venues, right? Like podcasts and different types of audiences where we can compress it in 3 minutes or less, so that it's more of a soundbite. People can capture the whole story, but they get enough context to understand it. And then, yes, to your point, when I give a keynote, whether it's live or virtual, I often tell that story in a much longer form, and I give different elements to the story than what we heard today. Because you have to imagine, with as crazy as this story is, the 3-minute version that I told today, or roughly however long it was, right? There's a lot of details missing. Right. And there's a lot of details that actually are formative and meaningful as it relates to like stories and movement in that story. And so I tell it completely differently from stage. What's interesting too is when I tell it from stage, and again, I'm going to call that virtual or live, that's the one place that I tell the story third person. I actually don't tell it first person. And I tell it third person about a story about a mom and 2 boys and this injury on a boy. And then I have a reveal moment. And the reason I do that is because it actually draws people in, because I'm telling the story as if it's not about me. And then I have a moment that I literally transition, and I've got a very physical, intentional way that I draw out like that this story was about me, and it sucks the audience in. And I do that because it is such a unique story that hearing someone tell it from the third person also makes it more relatable for people in the room. And then when they realize that it's me, there's a stronger connection to the rest of the keynote talk. And I've learned that over years. I used to always tell it first person. This was a shift I made probably 5 years ago, and it materially changed the way I connected with audiences.
But how do you, I mean, did you made an A/B test, or how do you know this, that the connection was?
So I had told my story in
stronger?
first person so many times that the very first time I told it in third person, literally it took one time of doing it, it's like the air got sucked out of the room. There was a completely different feeling, because when I tell it in first person, people see it, they're experiencing, they're tracking along, it is what it is. But like the story, particularly when you add more details, they're connected, it moves people, it's emotional. But when I do a reveal moment, it literally, like, and again, I'm not saying this like I'm a great storyteller by any means. I'm just saying this like I firsthand saw the difference the very first time I told the story. It was like the air got sucked out of the room and people were like in shock. And what's fascinating to me is my arm is shorter, it's smaller, it's different. I'll be telling the story on stage, often in short sleeves, about a kid who lost his arm. And the majority of the audience never connects it's me until I have a reveal moment, because they just don't notice.
Interesting, right?
And then all of a sudden you get to see them honing in on my arm. Like the air gets sucked out of the room, and then all of a sudden it's like the whole room starts focusing on my arm. It's just a different feel and a different delivery. I learned that technique though from a book. And then one of my original coaches, who's also a very, very good storyteller, one of the best I've ever heard,
What's his name?
was talking about moments to bring people into stories and have reveal moments that give those moments that people experience. So instead of a 5 to 10 minute dialogue around a story, what they're going to remember is that moment. Like, oh man, Brian was telling this story, and all of a sudden I connect the dots that it was him.
Yeah. What's the book called? What's the name of the book?
I knew you were going to ask me that as soon as I said it. It's called Resonate by Nancy Duarte. And when I turned around to look at the book on my shelf, I'm sure my camera just blurred out, but it's Resonate by Nancy Duarte. And what she really does is she talks about like how to create imagery in content, in presentations, in talks. She talks about ways to connect with audience. And so, you know, I think I've always had a natural gift for gab and talking and telling stories. but I've also been a student of my industry because I want to refine my own craft to make sure that whenever I have an audience, I can have the greatest amount of impact possible.